There's a certain stillness that comes before violence, a hush that feels almost spiritual, the kind of quiet you can only hear in stories about men who have seen too much. I remember watching the opening of the Equalizer 3 and feeling that hush wash over me like salt wind from a distant shore. What drew me in wasn't the gunfire or the choreography of vengeance. It was a calm between those storms, the look in a man's eyes who has spent his life trying to silence the echoes of everything he's done. By the time the film ended, I realized this wasn't just another action installment. It was a requiem disguised as retribution, a closing chapter about a man learning to live after spending decades learning how to kill. This third and final story takes us far from the gray streets of Boston and drops us on the sun-bleached coast of southern Italy, where Robert McCall, Denzel Washington's mysterious, self-exiled protector, drifts into a small coastal town and begins to dissolve into its rhythms. The premise seems simple. An old assassin seeking peace in a place where time moves slower than guilt. But nothing about McCall is simple. He's part monk, part ghost, part moral surgeon. The film begins not with an explosion but with aftermath. Blood already drying, smoke already fading, and McCall moving through it like a man tidying the remains of his own past. What struck me most was how director Antoine Fuqua slows the pulse of this story. The pacing feels meditative, almost European. You can smell the espresso, hear the shutters clatter in the morning breeze, feel the cobblestones underfoot. The camera lingers on still faces, empty piazzas, cracked plaster walls. It's the Italy of faded postcards and quiet prayers, a visual counterpoint to McCall's internal decay. When he limps through the narrow alleys, every step sounds like penance, even the violence, and there's plenty, lands like punctuation, never spectacle. What makes this film linger long after the credits is the tone of closure. Washington isn't playing an invincible hero anymore. He's portraying weariness itself. You see it in the tremor of his hands as he pours a cup of coffee, in the way his voice softens when he speaks to strangers. There's less fury and more mercy now, but the mercy feels earned through decades of solitude. I've always believed that every great action character eventually becomes a philosopher, and here, McCall joins that quiet lineage, a man who has learned that justice without compassion is just another form of cruelty. Fuqua shoots the violence like confession. The camera never flinches but never gawks. It witnesses. The sound design, subtle and textured, treats every movement like heartbeat rhythm. There's a kind of music in how McCall plans revenge, the careful placement of tools, the patience before the strike. But beneath that precision is exhaustion, the yearning of a man who wants to stop, but can't, because the world keeps handing him reasons to act. When he finds himself embraced by a small Italian community threatened by the local mafia, he becomes protector again, reluctantly, inevitably. Yet this time, the motive isn't righteousness, it's belonging. The setting changes everything. Italy, with its ruins and bells, becomes a mirror for redemption. Every frame glows with Mediterranean melancholy. Cinematographer Robert Richardson bathes the town in golden decay, making light itself feel ancient. It's as if the sun, tired of witnessing centuries of violence, finally learned how to forgive. McCall's black attire against these warm tones becomes symbolic. Death walking through life, searching for grace. The supporting characters, a kind pharmacist who treats his wounds, a young local police officer, even the priest who senses something divine and dangerous about him, all circle around McCall like facets of the conscience he's trying to rebuild. There's tenderness in how he listens, how he helps him with small, human gestures before the larger, brutal ones. One of my favorite moments isn't an action scene at all. It's him sitting silently in a cafe, watching children play, the camera resting on his face as something resembling peace flickers and fades. But, as always, peace invites intrusion. The mafia presence arrives like a cancer. Arrogant, loud, greedy, young men mistaking cruelty for power. When they harass the townspeople, you can almost feel McCall's pulse slow, the old instinct waking up like a lion stirred from sleep. Fuqua builds this tension with reverence. No slow-motion glamour, no orchestral blare, just inevitability. By the time McCall finally acts, it doesn't feel like revenge. It feels like gravity. I think what makes this story work isn't just the brutality, but the morality underneath it. The series has always asked one question. What is a good man of the world after he's done terrible things in its service? In this final chapter, that question becomes intimate. McCall's violence feels less like justice and more like exorcism, as though every act of vengeance burns away a piece of guilt. Yet, unlike so many Hollywood antiheroes, he isn't proud of it. The closer he gets to peace, the more he hesitates before each kill. You can sense he's praying, not for forgiveness, but for the chance to stop needing it. Fuqua and Washington share a rare chemistry between director and actor, a kind of unspoken trust that allows silence to speak louder than dialogue. There are long stretches without words where Denzel's eyes tell entire stories, a fatigue of grace, of a man who no longer seeks purpose but accidentally keeps finding it. His performance is a masterclass in restraint. Every gesture feels like a scar. When he smiles, and it happens rarely, it's like sunlight breaking through a funeral cloud. Thematically, the movie dances between mortality and mercy. It's as though McCall knows his time is ending, that each sunrise might be his last mission, his last act of grace. The pacing honors that mortality. Even the fight scenes, brutal, efficient, surgical, and quickly without flourish. Violence here is not entertainment. It's arithmetic. One body for another sin. One gesture closer to peace. There's poetry in the way Fuqua uses location. The crumbling architecture mirrors McCall's body, sturdy yet fading. The ocean beyond the town acts like conscience, calm on the surface, infinite beneath. Every time McCall stands at the pier, the composition feels like a prayer. The camera behind him, the horizon wide, the world unknowable. It's one of those rare action films that understands the holiness of loneliness. I've often thought the Equalizer trilogy is less about revenge than ritual, the ritual of balancing chaos through discipline, of restoring moral symmetry in a crooked world. This final story completes that ritual. The first film introduced a code, the second tested it, and the third finally questions it. McCall's stopwatch, that famous symbol of his precise justice, becomes almost ironic here. He no longer races time. He accepts it. When he sets the watch down in one of the film's quietest scenes, it's as if he's finally surrendering control, letting life move without measuring it. What surprised me most, though, was the tenderness. Amid the darkness, there are small, almost sacred gestures. Him fixing a cafe's broken door, leaving a flower on a grave, helping an old man cross the street. These acts, framed with the same care as the violent ones, suggest redemption doesn't arrive through grand sacrifice but through ordinary kindness. It's a theme so subtle you might miss it between the gunshots, but it's what elevates the film from thriller to meditation. In the final act, as dusk settles over the town, the film reaches its inevitable storm. The payoff is brutal but cathartic. Justice carried out not for glory, but for closure. Yet even as McCall dismantles evil, you feel sorrow rather than triumph. It's rare in modern cinema to see violence filmed with empathy. Fuqua and Washington make sure every death carries moral weight. Every act of destruction leaves a scar. The aftermath feels quiet, almost mournful, as though the world itself sighs with him. By the time the credits roll, the series has circled back to its essence. One man, alone, doing good in a broken world, and finally, perhaps, finding rest. There's no speech, no redemption monologue, no sentimental fade-out. Just the sense that for the first time, Robert McCall can stop walking. He's earned his stillness. For anyone who has followed his journey from the beginning, this third chapter feels like the last page of a diary written in blood and grace. It's not perfect, nor does it try to be. It's humble, somber, human, and that's what makes it beautiful. So, my literature-loving friends, if you come to the story expecting explosions, you'll find contemplation. If you expect vengeance, you'll find absolution. Beneath its steel and silence, the film offers a simple truth. Every act of justice must one day be balanced by forgiveness, even if the person you must forgive is yourself. The story opens not with triumph, but with aftermath. A quiet massacre inside a Sicilian winery, drenched in the kind of light that turns blood into rust. It's early morning, and the camera moves slowly through corridors of stillness. Bodies are strewn like punctuation marks after an argument that ended badly. A phone rings somewhere distant, unanswered. The first sound we hear is not dialogue but breath, slow, deliberate, almost meditative. Then the camera finds him. Robert McCall sits calmly in a leather chair, gloved hands resting on his knees, his black eyes steady. Around him lies the wreckage of men who thought they owned the world. Fuqua wastes no time reminding us of McCall is a man who kills not from impulse, but from conviction. But this time, there's fatigue in his silence, something elegiac in the way he surveys the damage. He's been shot in the back during the operation, the cost of one final errand. We don't yet know why he's here or who these men were, but the camera tells us everything. This is the end of an old life disguised as the beginning of a new one. As he limps out of the compound, the morning light feels merciless. His face is calm but pale, the way someone looks after too many confessions. Outside, the vineyard stretches like a graveyard of beauty. Sunlight slicing through the fog, vines whispering in the wind, rows of fruit waiting to rot. McCall collapses on the gravel road. A farmer's car rattles by, and within minutes, he's discovered by a passing patrolman from the nearby coastal town of Altamonte. The officer hesitates, unsure whether he's found a pilgrim or a killer. But McCall's eyes, heavy, honest, unafraid, earn him mercy. He's taken to a local doctor named Enzo Orizio, who tends him in an old stone house overlooking the sea. That's where the story exhales. For the first time in the series, McCall becomes still. The pace softens. The violence recedes into distance. He wakes to the sound of waves and church bells, the light spilling through white curtains. The doctor, played with warmth and suspicion, stitches his wound and keeps his secrets. McCall doesn't explain much. He rarely does. But his gratitude is real. The town, small and sun-worn, moves at a rhythm utterly alien to him. People know each other's names. Life revolves around food, gossip, faith, and the ocean. For a man who has lived in shadows, this place feels like a relic of innocence. As he begins to recover, we see him walking through cobbled streets, limping slightly, absorbing the texture of life. Children playing soccer, old men arguing about fish prices, women hanging laundry that flutters like prayer flags. The cinematography turns luminous. Richardson paints with sunlight. There's a serenity here that feels almost wrong for someone like McCall, as if grace has chosen the wrong soul. He drinks coffee at the same cafe every morning, sits in silence, and watches. People start recognizing him. The pharmacists who give him medicine, the cafe owner who insists on serving him pastries he doesn't want, the priest who senses that the stranger carries both violence and virtue. In one quiet sequence, a boy runs past him, tripping and scattering oranges across the road. McCall kneels to help him, and for a moment, we glimpse something almost fatherly in his eyes. It's that flicker of humanity that defines his first act, redemption growing in unlikely soil. He isn't trying to fix anything here. He's just existing, breathing, learning what peace feels like. But Fuqua plants unease in the background. Men in black cars, locals whispering names that sound like omens, and the faint echo of exploitation that hides beneath the town's charm. Soon, McCall learns that this idyllic place is under the quiet rule of a local Camorra crime family. They extort the fishermen, bully small shopkeepers, and treat the town as property. One scene shows them shaking down a cafe owner, the same man who's been kind to McCall. You can see the storm forming behind Denzel's stillness. He doesn't interfere at first. He observes, but you can feel the air tighten. This is what he's built for, the moment when decency meets cruelty. Fuqua stages these early confrontations with patience. There's a particularly tense exchange when McCall witnesses a group of thugs harassing a young woman near the pier. He doesn't act immediately. He simply stares. The leader, noticing the quiet stranger, mocks him, expecting fear. What he gets instead is that calm, surgical stare, the look that has preceded every reckoning in McCall's history. It's not anger, it's measurement. Seconds later, violence erupts with terrifying precision. The fight is short, clinical, and oddly merciful. When it ends, McCall's face shows no satisfaction, only inevitability. Afterward, word spreads to the town about the mysterious foreigner who defended one of their own. Some treat him as a savior, others fear him. The local mafia begins sniffing around, realizing a threat has appeared that doesn't play by their rules. They send scouts, make warnings, issue small retaliations, broken windows, vandalize boats, whispers a disappearance, but McCall remains composed. He starts spending more time with the townspeople, subtly fixing things, repairing the cafe door, helping an old man carry groceries, teaching a boy how to read the waves. You get the sense he's rehearsing normalcy, practicing being alive. Meanwhile, across the sea in the United States, a subplot begins to weave itself in. A young CIA agent named Emma Collins, played by Dakota Fanning, intercepts information about a drug shipment linked to the same crime family. She's competent, idealistic, and restless, the mirror of what McCall once was. The narrative alternates between her investigation and McCall's slow immersion in Italian life, until their threads inevitably begin to converge. The first half of the story is about contrast, calm and chaos, redemption and relapse, the desire to belong and the instinct to destroy. McCall's days grow warmer, the people friendlier, but there's always that shadow trailing him. One night, sitting in a cafe, he overhears a cafe owner's daughter crying. Her boyfriend, a fisherman, has refused to pay the mob tax and been beaten. The old McCall would have already planned retaliation. This new McCall hesitates. You can see the battle within him, his soul negotiating with his nature. But when he walks home through narrow streets and sees one of the mobsters slapping an old man outside a bakery, the hesitation ends. That night, rain falls over Altamonte, soft and relentless. McCall moves through the alleys like a ghost, the camera following his shadow rather than his face. There's no score, just footsteps and breath. He infiltrates the mafia's local stronghold, a crumbling villa that once belonged to nobility, now desecrated by greed. Inside, men drink and shout. He moves silently, disarming one, disabling another, every motion economical, every kill an act of grim arithmetic. Fuqua shoots it almost like a dance, the choreography precise, the brutality intimate. When it's over, McCall sits down, bloody but serene, his hand shaking slightly as he wipes the blade. It's the same opening tone repeated, aftermath as meditation. The next morning, the town wakes to news of an incident. The local enforcer's gone, their villa in flames. The people whisper, but don't ask. They know, instinctively, who did it. The priest looks at McCall differently at Mass. The cafe owner thanks him without saying the words. The air changes. You can feel a quiet liberation spreading through the streets. But McCall's peace doesn't return. There's that old restlessness again. The awareness that he's not finished, that the roots of corruption run deeper. As the first half closes, Emma Collins' investigation leads her directly to Italy. She arrives in Naples, following the trail of drug money and arms routes that point toward Altamonte. When she and McCall finally meet, it's not explosive, it's tender. She doesn't know who he really is at first, but their connection is immediate, almost familial. Denzel and Dakota share a history beyond the script. A reunion from Man on Fire, two souls meeting again, older and altered by time. The subtext of their interaction is rich. Mentor and protege, father and daughter, past and present. She asks him, "Did you ever stop?" And he pauses, smiles faintly, and says, "I tried." That one line captures everything the first half is built toward. The tragedy of a man who can't outrun his calling, and the quiet mercy of a world that keeps giving him another chance to try. By now, we understand the architecture of the story. The first half isn't about plot progression. It's about moral awakening. We've watched McCall bleed, heal, observe, belong, and relapse. The violence has purpose, but the silence has meaning. The town isn't just a backdrop. It's a character that mirrors his transformation, fragile, ancient, and finally remembering what dignity feels like. When the final shot of first act comes, McCall walking alone to the cobblestone street at dusk, the sea glowing bronze in the distance, it feels like prophecy. The quiet can't last. The mafia will retaliate, and peace, as always, must be defended with blood. The second half begins with the illusion of calm, that fragile silence that always arrives just before the world remembers it's violent. The sun has softened over Altamonte. Children laugh again in the square. Fishermen return with nets glinting under dawnlight, and McCall, limping but alive, seems for a heartbeat to have dissolved into ordinary life. But that peace is a lie that only he can sense. He knows the hierarchy of evil never dies with its soldiers. Somewhere above the man he killed sits a larger, hungrier predator, and the air itself feels restless, as if the sea breeze carries news of vengeance. The movie lets that tension build like pressure in the bones. When Emma Collins digs deeper into her investigation, she uncovers that the network McCall dismantled is part of a sprawling Camorra syndicate tied to narcotics, human trafficking, and arms smuggling routed to the Mediterranean. The thread leads directly to Altamonte, to a man named Vincent Quaranta, whose charm hides brutality. Vincent operates under the pretense of legitimacy, real estate deals, tourism projects, but everyone in town knows his signature smell, power masked with cologne. His men arrive each week in shiny SUVs, their sunglasses reflecting fear back at whoever dares to meet their gaze. They make polite threats in public and monstrous ones in private. Fuqua treats Vincent not as a cartoon villain, but as another mirror of corruption, youthful, impulsive, hungry for validation. When we first see him, he's drinking wine on a rooftop, watching fireworks bloom over the bay. His smile looks genuine until you notice how he grips the glass, like he's holding a throat. McCall observed from afar, blending with the crowd, studying him the way a tired lion studies another predator, calculating the cleanest kill. There's no anger in his eyes, only clarity. The film tightens around this inevitability. Emma's presence in Italy brings fresh energy. She represents the bureaucracy McCall once trusted but now transcends. She shares intelligence with local authorities, though most are compromised. Her instincts tell her there's an invisible hand helping her, cleaning messes she hasn't reached yet. One evening, she visits the charred ruins of the villa McCall destroyed. Among the debris she finds a calling card of sorts, a watch stopped at midnight, its glass cracked. She doesn't need confirmation. She knows whose ghost she's chasing. When they meet again, it's in a chapel by the sea. The scene is pure restraint. No dramatic revelation. No orchestral surge. Just candlelight flickering over stone walls. She confronts him gently, almost with affection. "You've been here all along," she says. He nods once, and the silence that follows feels heavier than confession. Their dialogue dances between admiration and warning. She reminds him the world doesn't belong to men like him anymore. He reminds her that sometimes justice needs to be personal. Yet beneath their exchange flows tenderness. She sees the father figure she lost. He sees the daughter he never had. When she leaves, you sense they both understand what must happen next, and that it will cost him the rest of his peace. Meanwhile, Vincent's retaliation begins. His men torch fishing boats, assault a market vendor, and spread fear like oil on water. Fuqua shoots these moments without glamour, handheld, raw, almost documentary. We see faces, not explosions. The panic of ordinary people realizing safety is an illusion. McCall watches, helpless at first, his conscience tightening like a noose. He visits the priest, asking not for absolution but for perspective. The priest tells him that sometimes God sends certain souls to do what others can't. McCall's reply is chilling in its simplicity. Then, maybe God should stop sending me. That night, the town's clock strikes 9 and McCall becomes what he was always meant to be. The Equalizer again. His movements are slower now, deliberate, each step echoing mortality. He infiltrates Vincent's estate during a lavish party filled with laughter, light, and the stench of impunity. The camera tracks him through the crowd like a specter. No one notices until it's far too late. What follows his violent stage is choreography. No gunfights in the streets, no drawn-out duels, only precision. He disables the power, isolates targets, and turns their wealth against them. In one unforgettable sequence, he traps Vincent's bodyguards in a wine cellar, flooding it while a faint aria plays upstairs. The sound design merges bubbles, gurgles, and muffled screams into something that feels like judgment sung in Latin. When McCall reaches Vincent, the confrontation is quiet. The young mobster tries bravado. Money offers threats, but his words dissolve against Denzel's calm. "You think you're God," Vincent spits. McCall answers, "No, but I've met him." The line lands like a psalm soaked in blood. Moments later, the violence ends not with spectacle but stillness. Fuqua cuts to the sound of the sea washing the shore, as though the earth itself is cleansing what just happened. But the story doesn't stop there. The aftermath becomes its own meditation. Emma returns to find the Camorra network collapsed overnight. Authorities attribute it to intergang warfare, but she knows better. When she tracks McCall, he's back among the townspeople, quietly helping repair what's been broken, rebuilding boats, handing coins to children, sweeping debris from streets. The locals treat him with reverence, not fear. There's an old-world acceptance here. They don't ask what he did. They thank God that someone did it. In these later scenes, the film breathes again. The violence recedes like a tide, leaving behind reflection. Fuqua lingers on textures, the hiss of espresso, the flutter of linen on balconies, the gentle rhythm of waves. McCall's limp has worsened. His body, like the town, bears scars that will never fully heal. Yet there's peace in him, the kind that doesn't erase pain, but lives beside it. Emma visits one last time to tell him the CIA is closing its files, that his name, whatever aliases he carried, will no longer exist in official records. "So what will you do now?" she asks. He smiles faintly. "Maybe I'll finally live." That final act isn't about redemption through repentance, but redemption through acceptance. The equalizer of others has become the reconciler of himself. In one quiet montage, he attends a town festival. Lanterns float over the bay, music hums through the square, and he sits among the crowd, anonymous yet home. A child hands him a small butterfly carved from wood, a symbol of transformation. He pockets it, looks up at the fireworks, and for the first time in 3 films, he genuinely smiles. Fuqua could have ended there, but he extends a moment with grace. The camera drifts above the town, revealing rooftops bathed in amber light, the sea darkening into velvet. McCall walks to the pier, leaning on his cane. He gazes at the horizon, and for a heartbeat we expect another explosion, another call to arms. Instead, we get silence, just a murmur of waves and a faint choir in the distance. It feels like prayer, the kind spoken by a man who has finally forgiven himself. The credits roll soon after, but the emotional afterglow lingers. What stays with you isn't the body count, but the moral arithmetic. The sense that every act of violence in McCall's life has led him to this fragile balance between duty and peace. The trilogy that began with outrage ends with surrender. Not defeat, but grace. Looking back at the second half, I realize how meticulously Fuqua structures rhythm. Tension, release, contemplation, redemption. Each violent act is countered by a human gesture. After every kill, a moment of kindness follows. A helping hand, a smile, a silent nod. It's as though McCall is rewriting his own story in real time, using compassion to overwrite carnage. By the end, the ledger of his soul finally evens out. For audiences expecting spectacle, the restraint might feel unfamiliar, but for those who follow McCall's journey, it feels like coming home. The camera no longer celebrates destruction, it celebrates stillness. The man who once measured justice with a stopwatch has thrown the watch away. Time for him has become eternal in the simplest sense, measured by peace instead of violence. As the screen fades to black, the message crystallizes. Redemption isn't found in heroism but in humanity. The equalizer of others has finally balanced himself. What fascinates me most about this final chapter is that it turns Robert McCall from a vigilante into something far rarer in modern cinema, a soul. For 2 films, he has been a mechanism, a man who measures time, calculates pain, and executes balance. In this last story, the machinery slows, and you begin to hear the human pulse beneath it. Denzel Washington has played many men of power, but never one so quietly dismantled by conscience. You can feel age pressing on him like gravity. The movements are slower, the breathing heavier, the silences longer. Every gesture seems to ask the same question. How much good can a man do before it no longer matters what he's done? When McCall first appears, he's already wounded. That physical injury becomes the emotional blueprint for the whole film. He walks as though each step costs memory, each exhale carries history. It's a subtle performance, less about words and about the way stillness can speak. The equalizer we once met was defined by precision. This one is defined by patience. Denzel allows cracks to show in the composure. He looks at kindness as though he can't quite believe it. And when he smiles, it feels like mercy breaking through habit. The arc isn't from weakness to strength, but from isolation to belonging, from self-control to surrender. The violence hasn't left him. It has simply lost its meaning, and that loss is the beginning of wisdom. Fuqua surrounds McCall with people who reflect the fragments of his conscience. Dr. Enzo is the first mirror, pragmatic, compassionate, unafraid. Their early scenes together have the rhythm of confession. The doctor tends to McCall's wound, but the real surgery happens in silence. We watch guilt being stitched shut. Enzo's patience introduces the film's theme that healing is not erasing scars, but living with them. Later, when the doctor tells him that the town has a rhythm of kindness, we see McCall pause as if try to remember what kindness feels like. That small hesitation is Denzel's genius. He lets you see a man remembering his own humanity in real time. The second mirror is Emma Collins. Dakota Fanning plays her with a calm intelligence that hides raw curiosity. She isn't an action sidekick. She's conscience incarnate. When she first meets McCall, she doesn't recognize him, and that unknowing allows their connection to be innocent before it becomes moral. There's a tenderness in how she speaks to him, respectful but firm, like a daughter trying to understand a complicated father. The chemistry between them is delicate, built on the quiet trust of shared decency. Watching them together feels almost like watching the two ends of a life meeting in the middle. Her idealism still bright, his idealism burnt down to coals. She reminds him of what justice looked like before it was stained by necessity. Fuqua uses Emma not to explain McCall, but to humanize him. In one small scene, she pours him coffee and asks, "Do you believe you were meant to do this?" The question lands with the force of prayer. Denzel's pause before answering is longer than the line itself. His eyes move downward, searching for an exit that doesn't exist. When he finally says, "I did once," you can feel the weight of every life he has taken collapse into that single syllable. She doesn't judge him. She simply listens, and in that listening he finds absolution. The relationship gives a film emotional balance. The young seeing the cost of righteousness, the old seeing the possibility of redemption. The third mirror is the town itself, especially the pharmacist Amina, the cafe owner Gio, and the nameless children who run through the square. They represent ordinary decency, unremarkable yet profound. Their presence forces McCall to confront the banality of goodness. These people survive through kindness, not violence, and their endurance unsettles him more than any enemy. He begins fixing their small problems. A door hinge, a lost key, a frightened child. And through those gestures he learns to participate in life rather than stand above it. The Equalizer becomes a neighbor. It's a humble evolution, and it makes the final scene so moving. When the town later protects him by silence, we realize he has finally been accepted not as weapon, but as one of them. Vincent Quaranta, the antagonist, operates as McCall's shadow. He's what McCall might have become had power remained untempered by conscience. Young, ruthless, stylish. He mistakes cruelty for control. Yet Fuqua directs him with sympathy, not caricature. We see the emptiness behind his bravado, the same hunger that once drove McCall to fight wars for invisible masters. Their confrontation isn't good versus evil. It's experience versus delusion. When McCall finally kills him, it feels less like triumph than euthanasia. He's putting down a sick idea of manhood. Denzel's physical performance in these moments deserves quiet study. Every movement is economy itself. The tilt of the head before violence, the measured blink after, the way his shoulders drop as if releasing the weight of one more necessary sin. He plays McCall as a craftsman, not a killer. Even his voice has changed. It's deeper, slower, carrying resignation instead of authority. You can sense that he's aware of his body failing. That time, not enemies, is the true opponent now. This mortality gives the character gravity. We no longer watch to see how he will win, but why he still bothers to fight. Fuqua's framing reinforces this metamorphosis. In the earlier films, McCall dominated space. The camera followed his precision. Here, the camera lingers at a respectful distance, as if observing a relic of an older world. He's part of the landscape now, absorbed by it. The vast Italian vistas dwarf him, yet they also cradle him. It's not the man who changes the world anymore. It's the world that finally softens a man. That shift in perspective makes the character feel complete. A warrior learning to retire into humanity. Emma's character grows in parallel. She begins as a curious operative chasing leads, and ends as a believer in moral nuance. By the end, Her professionalism coexists with compassion. She doesn't try to recruit McCall or arrest him. She simply lets him be. In one of their final exchanges, her look of understanding carries the same weight as a blessing. It's subtle, but you can tell that she'll carry his lesson into her own life. Justice without cruelty, duty without ego. Supporting characters each add a note to the emotional symphony. Dr. Enzo embodies forgiveness. The priest represents faith without judgment. Gio symbolizes community. The old fisherman, resilience. Through them, we see the values McCall rediscovers: healing, belief, belonging, endurance. The cumulative effect is that by the time the final scene arrives, the viewer realizes the film has been less about vengeance than about apprenticeship, an old soul teaching a town and himself how to live decently again. Even the villain's henchmen function symbolically. They're young, reckless, full of noise, the antithesis of McCall's quiet discipline. Their deaths are never sensationalized. Each encounter is staged as a moral equation. Arrogance minus empathy equals extinction. Watching McCall dismantle them feels like watching time correct impatience. There's something almost fatherly in his cruelty. Not sadistic, just inevitable, as though he's teaching them a final lesson in consequence. Underneath all of this is Denzel's spiritual undertone. He doesn't play McCall as atheist or believer, but as a man negotiating with God through deeds. His prayers aren't spoken, they're enacted. Each act of protection becomes liturgy, each gesture of kindness a confession. The final smile at the festival isn't relief, it's faith reborn. The transformation is complete. From executioner to guardian, from outsider participant, from instrument of balance to vessel of peace. It's tempting to call this redemption, but I think it's closer to reconciliation. McCall doesn't erase his sins. He integrates them. He accepts that the same hands that took lives can also save them. That complexity is what makes him one of the rare modern action protagonists who feels biblical without preaching. He's Job after the storm, Abraham after the sacrifice, a man who has finally stopped arguing with destiny and started conversing with grace. Every actor around him orbits this quiet gravity. Dakota Fanning's gentleness prevents the film from sinking into despair. Her presence reminds us that innocence still exists somewhere beyond McCall's horizon. Eugenio Mastrandrea as a policeman gives the story its youthful hope, a next generation capable of courage without blood. And Andrea Scarduzio's Vincent ensures that evil remains seductive enough to test virtue. Together they create a moral ecosystem where goodness survives not because it's stronger, but because it's stubborn. By the time credits approach, Robert McCall has become less a character than an idea, the embodiment of weary righteousness, the proof that violence can evolve into wisdom if guided by empathy. The town, once afraid of him, now laughs with him. Children run past without fear. The transformation is complete precisely because it's small. Nothing miraculous happens. Yet everything changes. In that ordinariness lies grace. Denzel Washington achieves what few actors can. He humanizes silence. You could watch the film with the sound muted and still understand every emotion. His eyes carry dialogue better than most scripts. When he sits at the pier, looking at the endless blue, you realize the trilogy's true arc has never been about justice, but about stillness. The hard-won serenity that comes when a man finally forgives himself for surviving. And so the character analysis ends where the man begins, in quiet. McCall's story reminds us that even those who spend their lives balancing others must eventually learn to balance themselves. He doesn't ascend into legend. He dissolves into community. The Equalizers become equal. One of the strangest things about this final Equalizer story is how quietly it was born. For a film so soaked in death and moral weight, its creation began not with studio demand but with friendship, a simple conversation between Denzel Washington and Antoine Fuqua after years of shared rhythm. They'd already made 2 Equalizers together, but this time both men were older, slower, quieter. They didn't want another chapter of vengeance. They wanted an ending of acceptance. The idea came to them, according to Fuqua, over coffee at the Hotel Bel Air. Denzel had been talking about Italy, about how peaceful it felt to walk through streets where history hums beneath your shoes. Fuqua listened and said, almost jokingly, maybe that's where McCall finally stops. What started as a passing thought became the anchor of the whole film, a thriller built around stillness. Here's the paradox. The Equalizer 3 was shot like an action picture, but conceived like a meditation. Fuqua called it a Western set in Italy. He replaced the desert with stone villages, the cowboy with an aging assassin, the saloon shootout with a cafe conversation. The production itself mirrored that duality. Filming began on the Amalfi Coast in late 2022, specifically in a tranny and Amalfi, postcard-perfect places that had rarely hosted Hollywood crews. Locals remember how the town changed for those months. The streets filled with lighting rigs, the scent of espresso mingling with the smell of diesel generators, and the odd calm of seeing Denzel Washington walking alone at dawn before the day's chaos. He reportedly spent mornings talking to fishermen before shooting began, absorbing the cadence of their lives. That habit seeped into his performance. The slow pace, the pauses, the soft laughter when he finally feels part town. One of the production's oddest blessings came from geography itself. Fuqua had planned large-scale action in Naples, but budget and permits forced him to condense most scenes into smaller, older streets. What might have been limitation became genius. The narrow alleys gave the fights intimacy, forcing choreography that felt claustrophobic, almost tactile. The team said Denzel insisted on rehearsing those sequences like stage plays, counting steps, measuring breaths. He's never used doubles for close-quarters fights. He choreographs rhythm rather than movement. He once said the sound of a knife being unsheathed tells the story better than seeing it swing. In this film, that philosophy defines every kill. The strangest creative decision might be how much violence they removed. Early drafts had twice as many confrontations, but Denzel asked Fuqua to cut the noise. He wanted each act of retribution to feel like punctuation, not paragraph. That restraint made the final cut brutal but sacred, closer to ritual than spectacle. Fuqua later admitted that when he screened early edits for test audiences, some fans begged for more action, and Denzel replied simply, "No, he's tired." That became a mantra during editing. McCall's fatigue shaped the film's tempo. Even the score slows with him. Danny Bensi and Saunder Jurions replaced rapid percussion with drawn-out cello lines that sound like breath held too long. The music moves as though the instruments themselves are aging. One lesser-known fact is that The Equalizer 3 nearly wasn't a third film at all. It was originally planned as a streaming prequel about McCall's CIA years. But Washington refused. "He's interesting because he's past that life," he said. The studio pivoted, and suddenly the project became a swan song. That shift changed everything. Tone, structure, even cinematography. Robert Richardson, known for his work with Scorsese and Tarantino, joined the team and decided to shoot on digital but light it as if it were celluloid. He used soft amber diffusion filters to make Italian daylight feel nostalgic, like memory rather than present tense. Look closely during the cafe scenes. There's a faint halo around McCall's silhouette. That's not digital bloom. It's Richardson painting mortality with light. Another subtle secret hides in the opening massacre. Every photograph on the winery's wall, the ancestors staring down from dusty frames, were real Amalfi villagers, not props. Fuqua had local families lend ancestral portraits, giving the set an authenticity that feels haunted. He said later, "It's like the ghosts of the town were watching him clean house." That's why the opening feels more tragic than thrilling. The violence occurs under generations of eyes. Behind the camera, the crew adopted a curious ritual that became legend among locals. Each morning, before rolling the first shot, Fuqua would gather the main team near the church steps and say one line aloud: "Balance must be restored." It began as a private joke referencing the franchise's tagline, but gradually it became a moral compass. Whenever production grew tense, someone would whisper it again. By the end, even the Italian extras were repeating it. It's eerie how that line echoed the film's message, order through compassion. Denzel himself became almost monk-like during the shoot. Crew members noticed he rarely checked his phone, avoided the usual on-set chatter, and spent breaks watching the sea in silence. He called it method without pretending. One assistant said he'd sometimes sit for hours, then walk back onto set and deliver a scene as if he carried the entire ocean's stillness inside him. Fuqua described directing him as like praying with someone who already knows the scripture. That synergy is visible on screen. Every frame feels like trust caught on camera. There's also the quietly delightful fact that Dakota Fanning's casting wasn't studio nostalgia. It was Denzel's idea. He called Fuqua after reading the script and said, "You know who should play the agent? The little girl from Man on Fire. Let's finish that circle." 18 years had passed since he carried her through Mexico City in that earlier film. When she arrived in Italy, their reunion wasn't staged for publicity. The crew said the first time they met on set, they simply hugged and stayed quiet. You can see that history in their scenes, affection without exposition. Fanning later said it felt like filming with family you lost but somehow found again. The symmetry is uncanny. Two characters, one's protector and child, now equals across time. Fuqua's fascination with Catholic symbolism runs through production. The script is dotted with crosses, candles, confessions. Yet religion here is metaphor, not doctrine. In one behind-the-scenes interview, he confessed that he asked every department head to imagine they were preparing for a funeral, not an action movie. "Light like redemption," he told Richardson. "Dress it like mourning," he told costume designer Jenny Egan. That's why McCall's wardrobe gradually lightens. Black in the opening, charcoal mid-film, gray-blue by the finale. It's a visual resurrection. By the festival scene, he's almost luminous, the color of calm water. Even stranger are the sound choices. The final pier sequence includes a faint choir you might assume is score, but it's actually real villagers recorded singing vespers from a nearby monastery. Fuqua layered those voices under ambient waves, then slowed them slightly to sound otherworldly. The effect is subconscious. You feel holiness without realizing you're hearing humans. That auditory ghostliness mirrors McCall's transformation, death dissolving into life. The film also hides small tributes to people Denzel and Fuqua lost. The cafe's name, Cafe Johnny, honors Fuqua's late Italian mentor. The boat McCall helps repair is called Lily, named after Denzel's mother. Even the butterfly carving the child gives him was handcrafted by a local artisan whose shop burned down during production. Denzel bought every surviving piece and gifted them to crew members after wrap. These details never appear in marketing, yet they permeate the atmosphere of sincerity that defines the movie. Technically, the film pushed stop-motion-like precision in fight choreography. Stunt coordinator Oliver Kirkland used medical diagrams to map each kill based on McCall's supposed background as an intelligence operative. Every wound corresponds to real anatomical knowledge. Denzel studied those patterns obsessively. He said the goal wasn't to impress, but to respect reality. In one scene, when he slides a blade under a man's arm to sever nerves instead of arteries, that motion came from Denzel's research into surgical procedures. The result is unsettling efficiency, violence filmed like anatomy. Another strange layer involves time itself. Watch the clock scattered through the film. Each one reads a different hour, yet the hands always form a near-perfect cross. It's a secret motif designed by the production designer, Naomi Shohan. She called it the crucifix of time, McCall's life measured not by minutes but by redemption. Even the broken watch Emma finds bears that same alignment. It's subliminal theology embedded in props. Perhaps the most poetic behind-the-scenes moment happened during the final night shoot in a tranny. As they filmed McCall walking down the pier, a real storm gathered offshore. Fuqua was about to delay, but Denzel insisted they roll cameras. Lightning flashed far beyond the horizon, framing his silhouette in natural strobe. They used only one take. When the lightning subsided, the entire crew applauded quietly, sensing they'd captured something unrepeatable, nature itself granting closure. Fuqua later said that in that instant, he felt the trilogy end not by design but by blessing. Even stranger is how life imitated art after production. Locals of Amalfi now call the pier La Bilancia, the balance. They place a small plaque there that reads in Italian, "Peace is the last act of justice." It's unofficial, not commissioned by the studio, just gratitude from townspeople who felt the film honored them. Visitors still stop to photograph it, unaware that they're standing on the fictional grave of a fictional man who somehow became real. During post-production, Fuqua experimented with alternate endings. One early cut had McCall leaving Italy aboard a bus, disappearing into anonymity. Test audiences disliked it. It felt incomplete. Denzel suggested the opposite. Let him stay. He's earned the chair by the sea, he he said. That single line reshaped the finale into the gentle permanence we now have. The hero doesn't ride into the sunset. He sits beneath it. The last shot is no longer escape, but arrival. The marketing, too, carried curious contradictions. Trailers promise explosive closure, yet what audiences receive is elegy. Some critics misread the stillness as fatigue, but others saw its courage. Fuqua defended his tone, saying, "Silence is the loudest thing we have left." That philosophy, whispered through the entire production, explains why The Equalizer 3 feels unlike any modern franchise movie. It's built on absence. Every omission is intentional. Fewer lines, fewer cuts, fewer explanations. What remains is essence. There's even an unconfirmed legend among crew members that Denzel carried a small notebook labeled balances where he wrote down acts of kindness done by the team, a list of names and gestures, from a grip who fixed a light to a caterer who shared food with children. On the last day, he read them aloud and said, "Now it's even." No journalist ever captured that on video, but multiple extras swear happened. Whether myth or memory, it fits perfectly. Art and life reached equilibrium. When you stack these details together, the film begins to feel enchanted by coincidence. An aging actor finding grace in Italy, a director confronting faith through genre, a reunion with a child star who once symbolized innocence, now grown into conscience, real lightning illuminating the final frame, villagers singing real prayers in the background. It's as if the movie wasn't filmed but revealed, piece by piece, by the world itself. That's the strangest truth of all, that a story about a man obsessed with balance was created through accidents that balance themselves. Every constraint, budget, weather, age, became design. The Equalizer didn't just find peace on screen. His makers found behind the camera. When Fuqua wrapped production, he wrote one line in his journal: "We didn't finish a film, we finished a life." And watching it now, knowing these hidden currents, you realize how right he was. The movie is haunted not by ghosts of vengeance, but by gratitude, a farewell whisper by craftsmen who finally learned, like McCall, to stop measuring time and simply exist inside it. Critics are often split when it comes to stories like this. Tales of redemption that arrive wrapped in gunfire, meditations disguised as genre. When The Equalizer 3 released, you could almost sense the confusion in the reviews. Some saw a thriller too slow to thrill. Others saw a morality play too violent to preach. But what both camps missed, or perhaps feared to articulate, was that the film was never trying to fit inside either box. It wasn't built to entertain. It was built to exhale. Antoine Fuqua crafted it like an ending note to a song that had played for too long, and Denzel Washington delivered it as a benediction. Watching it again, months after the noise of its release, the critical noise fades, and what remains is purity, a man, a town, and a truth that power and peace rarely coexist in the same body. The critical landscape in 2023 was an odd one. Audiences had grown weary of repetition, of franchise fatigue. Every blockbuster seemed designed by committee, chasing spectacle rather than sincerity. Then came this, a film with the audacity to whisper. It opened quietly on Labor Day weekend, with no gimmicks, no Marvel-style hype, and earned its audience slowly, like trust regained. Some reviewers from The Guardian and Empire noticed this tonal rebellion. They wrote that the film moves at the pace of healing, and that Denzel acts less like a savior and more like a man remembering how to breathe. Others, particularly American outlets accustomed to rhythm, complained about its tempo. It's too slow, too sentimental, too reflective. They said, missing that those very words are virtues in a story about a man who has finally stopped running. But to the critics who listened, the film revealed a deeper architecture. Fuqua's use of space and silence became the real action. Every pause was a moral question. Every still frame a decision. Scholars of film ethics might even say that The Equalizer 3 transforms vigilante cinema into philosophical parable. Instead of showing what justice looks like, it asks whether it should exist at all once violence becomes personal. McCall's redefinition of equilibrium, not through retribution but through community, echoes a late-career moral evolution of characters like Clint Eastwood's William Money in Unforgiven or Travis Bickle's Imagined Peace at the end of Taxi Driver. Yet where those films end in irony or guilt, this one ends in tranquility. It's rare to see a character this brutal achieve gentleness without hypocrisy. Fuqua's own commentary reinforces that. In multiple interviews, he rejected the idea of the film as retirement cinema. He called it spiritual closure. He said, "I don't think McCall retires. I think he ascends." It's a loaded phrase, one that made some critics uncomfortable. But watching the film, you understand what he means. McCall doesn't escape the world. He transcends logic. Every violent franchise hero seeks to end pain by inflicting more of it. McCall ends pain by learning to stop. The final frame, that small smile on the piazza, is the antithesis of every revenge film ever made, an ending that whispers instead of detonates. The reception among general audiences mirrored this divide. The opening weekend numbers were strong, but not explosive. The conversations, however, lasted longer than most summer spectacles. Fans of the earlier installments appreciated the shift in tone. Social media became a forum for share quiet. People posting clips of the cafe, the church bells, the sea, writing captions like, "I want to live like this when I'm tired of everything." Others, expecting adrenaline, left theaters unsure how to process serenity. Yet the film kept drawing repeat viewers. The data showed something rare. Attendance grew in its second and third weeks. Proof that stillness, when done sincerely, travels by word of mouth, not algorithm. Academically, the movie's reception in film journals was fascinating. Some critics began connecting the Equalizer 3 to the tradition of neo-noir redemption arcs. A few even called it the first post-vigilante film, meaning it acknowledges that the archetype has outlived its usefulness. In this reading, McCall becomes a meta-commentary on the entire genre, a weapon who retires himself, a symbol of closure for decades of masculine guilt in cinema. Where once we celebrated men who could kill efficiently, we now yearn for men who can forgive completely. Denzel's gravitas allows that transition to feel earned rather than forced. The Venice Film Festival crowd, surprisingly, gave a standing ovation when it premiered there. That response wasn't about the plot. Critics there already knew what kind of story it was. It was about tone. Europeans understood the Italian setting as more than backdrop. They saw it as confession booth. The cinematography, drenched in sunset melancholy, reminded reviewers of Paolo Sorrentino's visual theology, beauty as apology. La Repubblica wrote that the film feels less like Hollywood than Hemingway, an American hero finally learning to die beautifully. Of course, not every critic was charitable. Some called it manipulative, saying Fuqua used Catholic imagery to disguise violence as redemption. But that accusation misunderstands both the director and his protagonist. The imagery isn't sanctimonious. It's sacramental. The church bells, the wine, the pier, they're not religious. They're ritualistic. McCall's journey isn't to find God, but to find quiet. That's why the most powerful scene isn't the massacre, but the moment when he stops his watch and never restarts it. The critics who saw that gesture understood everything. Time for him was always a measure of control. By surrendering it, he admits he's no longer in command. That single act, stopping time, is his absolution. Thematically, reviewers often compare the film to John Wick 4, released the same year, calling them opposites in philosophy. Wick seeks meaning through endless motion. McCall seeks peace through stillness. Both men have lost everything. Both live by codes. Both kill with poetry. But while Wick dies performing his code, McCall lives by breaking his. In that contrast lies one of the quiet triumphs of the Equalizer 3. It becomes a commentary on the exhaustion of cinematic masculinity. The old myth of the stoic avenger finally collapses into empathy. McCall's evolution tells us that the truest strength is surrender. Critics who recognize that place the film alongside Gran Torino and Logan. Other farewells that substitute vulnerability for vengeance. Beyond critics, real-world events around the release gave the movie accidental resonance. It premiered amid rising conversations about mental health, post-trauma, and aging in men who wants to find themselves through work or violence. Viewers wrote essays connecting McCall's exhaustion to soldiers' PTSD, to first responders burned out by years of chaos, to ordinary men rethinking pride. Fuqua admitted later that the letters he received weren't from action fans, but from people who saw in McCall their own yearning for stillness. One retired Marine wrote, "He killed less and prayed more. I understood that." Another wrote, I watched it twice, not for the fights, but for how he sat in silence. Those responses moved the director more than box office numbers. What few realize is that the production itself became a small event for Italy. Local mayors of Trani and Amalfi invited Fuqua back after release to screen the film outdoors for residents. They turned the piazza that served as McCall's home into a theater. Denzel attended quietly, sitting in the back with a baseball cap. When the film ended and the townspeople applauded, he reportedly said, Now this feels like his home. That screening blurred fiction and reality. The same streets that hosted violence on screen now filled with laughter and community. It was, in a way, McCall's redemption brought into the real world. Critically, one of the most perceptive analyses came from a scholar at the University of Rome who described the film as a meditation on proportionality. He noted that McCall no longer kills in proportion to offense, but in proportion to need. Violence becomes moral mathematics. This echoes the film's recurring theme of balance. Fuqua visualizes it constantly. Symmetrical frames mirror doorways, reflections in puddles, even the sea meeting the sky in perfect horizon lines. Critics who notice the symmetry understood it as more than aesthetic. It's psychological. McCall's desire for balance had become metaphysical. He's not equalizing crime anymore, but equalizing his own soul. A curious moment in the global reception was how differently audiences interpreted the ending. Western critics saw it as peace. Eastern critics, particularly in Japan and South Korea, read it as karmic cycle. McCall trapped in eternal duty. To them, his smile wasn't finality, but readiness for whatever suffering comes next. It's fascinating how cultural frameworks shape perception. What looks like heaven to one tradition looks like reincarnation to another. Perhaps both are right. Perhaps peace is just another form of continuation. When award season arrived, few expected the Equalizer 3 to appear on ballots. It wasn't that kind of movie. But something interesting happened. Denzel's performance became a talking point in actor roundtables, discussed with reverence usually reserved for Oscar bait. Critics from The Hollywood Reporter noted how he made weariness kinetic. They said, he doesn't act tired, he moves tired. That kind of embodiment rarely gets recognized in action genres. Yet some fans began calling it the quietest great performance of the decade. The film's reputation began to grow in whispers. Fittingly, perhaps the most unexpected critical event was how faith-based outlets embraced it. Christian reviewers, usually wary of R-rated violence, interpreted the film as modern parable. They compare McCall's transformation to St. Paul's, describing the violence as allegory for sin purged through sacrifice. Meanwhile, secular critics dismissed that reading as sentimentality. But maybe that clash is part of the film's charm. It exists at the border of both worlds, sacred and profane, moral and mortal. It can be read as theology or therapy, depending on what the viewer needs. Another subtle critical dialogue emerged around his portrayal of Italy itself. Some cultural critics accuse Fuqua of romanticizing the region into stereotype. Cobblestone's espresso, gentle peasants. Others argued he was using it deliberately, turning Italy into metaphor for eternal rest, a land where even killers can nap in sunlight. I think both are true. The town isn't real Italy. It's McCall's heaven projected onto geography. That's why no scene shows modern cities or politics. Time itself seems suspended. Critics who approached it as realism missed the point. It's poetry. Box office analysts later called it the most successful Labor Day release since 2019. But the real success wasn't numerical. The critical conversation that followed reshaped how audiences talk about endings. For years, franchises refused closure. Everything teased sequels. Then the Equalizer 3 arrived and said, no, endings matter. Reviewers began connecting it to a broader fatigue in cinema culture, a craving for finality. In that sense, McCall's farewell became symbolic for an entire era of storytelling that had forgotten how to stop. Film festivals and retrospectives have since begun re-evaluating Fuqua's trilogy. Critics now describe it as a moral arc of craftsmanship. The first film represents control, the second chaos, the third clarity. Retrospective essays note that as Denzel aged, the camera slowed. Each installment becomes quieter, a visual decrescendo. The Equalizer 3 completes that descent into silence. Future students of film will probably study it as the moment American action cinema rediscovered humility. And yet, the strangest critical reaction came not from professionals, but from ordinary people writing online diaries. Scroll through long Reddit threads and you'll find comments like, "He looked at peace and I cried," or "I never thought a franchise film would make me pray." That's not normal fan discourse. That's communal catharsis. It's proof that art doesn't need complexity to be profound, just sincerity. The critical elite, with their jargon and frameworks, sometimes forget that a quiet sigh from an honest film can outlive volumes of theory. Looking back at all these reactions, you begin to see The Equalizer 3 as more than a movie. It became a small moral event. It asks whether we can outgrow violence, whether men conditioned to protect through force can learn to protect through gentleness. The critical dialogue around it reflected the world's own struggle with that question. Some critics defended power, others defended peace. In that debate, the film did what great cinema should. It held a mirror to the audience and let them argue with their reflection. So, when people today revisit the reviews, they might see inconsistency, contradiction, even confusion. But that's exactly what makes it beautiful. The Equalizer 3 isn't a film you get. It's a film you settle into like dusk. Critics wrote essays. Audiences wrote prayers. Somewhere between the two lies its true legacy. Not as a perfect film, but as a necessary one, reminding the world that even in the loudest medium of all, silence can still win. There's something almost mystical about the way The Equalizer 3 was made, as though the production itself reflected the story it was trying to tell, a process of slowing down, simplifying, and letting silence guide the craft. By the time Antoine Fuqua and Denzel Washington reunited to close McCall's journey, they had both aged into a kind of mastery that doesn't shout anymore. Every creative decision felt deliberate, patient, and strangely personal, like a group of artists finally ready to say goodbye on their own terms. Principal photography began in October 2022 on the Amalfi Coast, specifically in the towns of Mastrandrea, Amalfi, and Naples. Unlike most action films that thrive on industrial efficiency, Fuqua ran this shoot like a retreat. There were no giant sets or endless night shoots. Days started early, finished before sunset, and were guided by light rather than schedule. The production relied almost entirely on natural sunlight and practical fixtures, candles, lanterns, or the reflection of the sea bouncing off pastel walls. Cinematographer Robert Richardson, a three-time Oscar winner known for his luminous work on Hugo and The Aviator, approached Italy like a painter confronted by too much beauty. He once said, "We didn't want to capture Italy. We wanted to let Italy capture us." Richardson shot the entire film using the ARRI Alexa LF with Panavision T-Series anamorphic lenses, often stopping down to maintain depth even in shadow. The result is breathtaking, soft halos, glowing edges, and a texture that feels both dreamlike and grounded. Every frame breathes salt and sunlight. The color palette shifts from sepia to blue to gold, mirroring McCall's emotional temperature. Sepia in his pain, blue in his isolation, gold in his acceptance. Even Denzel's wardrobe evolves alongside it. Costume designer Jenny Egan starred him in funereal black and gradually transitioned him to softer grays and blues. She described it as dressing a man who's forgetting to armor himself. The first day of shooting was the winery massacre, a daunting decision. Most directors save their action centerpiece for later in production, but Fuqua wanted the tone set from the first frame. They built that Sicilian estate on the outskirts of Naples, using an abandoned monastery as the base structure. Everything inside, the furniture, the artwork, the dusty wine barrels, was sourced from local artisans. Richardson flooded the set with natural morning light, then punctured with smoke for atmosphere. The sequence was shot handheld, with long takes that trace McCall's movement through aftermath rather than action. Fuqua called it the calmest carnage I've ever filmed. It took only 3 days, a fraction of what typical Hollywood fight scenes require. Denzel performed nearly all the movements himself, including the moment where he drags his wounded leg through the doorway. That limp wasn't scripted. He injured his ankle during rehearsal and decided to keep it, saying he's getting old, so let him feel it. Local Italians became part of the crew in ways no studio could have planned. Because the tranny streets are too narrow for trucks, every piece of equipment had to be carried by hand. Cameras, cables, even generators. Villagers volunteered, sometimes bringing their children to help, turning each shoot into a communal event. The town priest even blessed the production one morning, sprinkling holy water on the dolly track. Fuqua later said it was the first set where he felt genuinely protected. The locals warmed and fused every frame. You can see it in how the extras look at Denzel, not acting, just responding to his presence with natural respect. Another interesting production choice was the use of real interiors. Fuqua hates green screens. Every cafe, every apartment, every church in the film is a real location, often over a century old. That authenticity shaped the film's rhythm. Shooting was limited by daylight filtering through small windows, so scenes naturally became slower, more intimate. The sound of the sea is real too. In post-production, they mix in location recordings instead of synthetic waves. You can even hear birds from the Amalfi Cliffs if you listen closely during the quiet scenes. One of the most challenging sequences to film was a festival scene at the end. It required over 200 extras, lanterns on the sea, and fireworks timed precisely with camera moves. The team spent weeks coordinating tides and weather. When the night finally arrived, a storm threatened to cancel everything. Fuqua almost called off, but Denzel, calm as always, suggested they wait. Within an hour, the clouds parted, revealing a still bay under moonlight. They shot until dawn. Richardson later said the glow on the water wasn't lighting, it was moon reflection. "You can't plan faith like that," he said. That single sequence, less than 5 minutes on screen, became a metaphor for the whole film. Patience rewarded by grace. Dakota Fanning's scenes were shot mostly in Rome and Naples. Her reunion with Denzel became a small legend among the crew. They hadn't worked together since Man on Fire in 2004, when she was 9 years old. On her first day, she brought him a photograph of the two of them from that film. He laughed, hugged her, and said, "Now you're protecting me." Their chemistry was effortless. Fuqua rarely directed their interactions, preferring improvisation. In the cafe scene where she tells him, "You can rest now," that line wasn't scripted. It came out naturally during rehearsal, and Fuqua kept it, saying it was the emotional heart of the movie. Music played an equally integral role. For this final installment, Fuqua turned to composers Marcelo Zarvos and Harry Gregson Williams, blending ambient textures with classical Italian motifs. The score avoids heavy percussion. Instead, it breathes through strings, clarinet, and occasional piano. The main theme, titled Balance Restored, features a recurring 7-note motif that mimics McCall's breathing pattern. During recording, Fuqua asked the orchestra play as if exhaling after confession. They recorded at Abbey Road Studios, using a 64-piece ensemble, but mixed it down to sound intimate, almost chamber-like. The final track playing during the credits, The Quiet Man, includes faint sea sounds recorded from the Amalfi set, mixed so softly you feel them rather than hear them. Denzel's preparation process deserves its own mythology. Unlike method actors who live inside their characters, he isolates moments. Before each scene, he spends several minutes alone in silence, controlling his breathing until it slows to the rhythm of McCall's. On the Equalizer 3, this became ritual. Crew members said that when Denzel was ready, the entire set went silent automatically. You could hear waves or footsteps, but no voices. Then Fuqua would whisper, "Action!" and Denzel would move like he'd been alive in that moment forever. His focus altered time. One camera assistant described it perfectly. When he's on set, you stop feeling like you're making a movie. You feel like you're witnessing something inevitable. The relationship between Fuqua and Richardson also created an atmosphere of reverence. Fuqua trusted him completely, often asking, "What does the light want?" instead of giving technical direction. Richardson, who had worked with directors like Scorsese and Oliver Stone, said he'd never heard that phrase before, but it fit. In Italy, light does want something. It demands respect. They even adjusted shooting schedules based on church bells. Every hour, when the bells rang, Fuqua stopped filming for 30 seconds, so the sound would remain natural on the soundtrack. Later in editing, he used those bells as transitions between chapters, marking McCall's spiritual progress. A touching fun fact, Denzel's daily ritual involved giving one villager a small gift, sometimes a signed book, sometimes money for repairs, sometimes just conversation. On his last day, the townspeople surprised him with a framed painting of the Amalfi coastline inscribed, "Per la pace ritreveda," for the peace you found. He reportedly teared up. When he left, the mayor said, "He came here to end a story and started one for us." Technically, the film's editing by Conrad Buff III, who worked on Terminator 2, and Billy Weber aimed for emotional pacing. They avoided traditional coverage and preferred single shots that linger, trusting faces to carry rhythm. Buff later said that one of the hardest challenges was not cutting, resisting the instinct to speed up. Fuqua told him, "If you feel like you should cut, wait 3 seconds." That patience defines the film's personality. Each pause feels earned, each silence heavy with possibility. Another behind-the-scenes curiosity involves Denzel's own input in rewriting dialogue. The screenplay by Richard Wenk originally contained much more exposition about McCall's CIA past and trauma. Denzel stripped most of it, insisting the audience already knew enough. Mystery is the only armor he has left, he told Wenk. That choice gave the character more dignity, a man defined by presence rather than explanation. Wenk later said he rewrote with Denzel's silences in mind. It's a rare thing when an actor shapes writing through absence rather than addition. The production's emphasis on simplicity extended to weapons and props. McCall's tools are minimal, a cane, a knife, and occasionally improvised objects. Fuqua banned flashy gadgets. He said, "Violence should feel handmade." The prop master worked with ex-Special Forces consultants to design believable instruments of justice. The cane McCall uses was custom-built from Italian walnut and weighted for balance, symbolizing both vulnerability and control. Denzel kept it after filming ended. He reportedly said, "It reminds me to walk slow." One unplanned event that became art occurred during filming of a night scene at the docks. A stray cat wandered into the shot and sat beside McCall's foot as he watched the waves. Instead of stopping, Denzel reached down, petted it once, and kept acting. Fuqua kept the take. Later, in editing, they use it as a metaphor. Even predators attract trust when they find peace. The cat became an accidental icon of gentleness amid violence. Fuqua also encouraged improvisation in the local extras. Many scenes of the townspeople talking in cafes or markets are unscripted. He'd roll cameras and let them gossip naturally. Their Italian chatter, loosely translated later, adds authenticity. If you speak the language, you'll catch snippets of jokes about the quiet American and speculation about his past. It's those spontaneous touches that give the film its lived-in texture. Post-production was unusually introspective. Fuqua and Richardson spent months color grading with precision bordering on devotion. They created a palette curve called Mediterranean dust, muted blues, faded whites, ochres softened by haze. They even added microscopic digital grains to mimic film stock from the 1970s, creating warmth in shadow. Every adjustment aimed to make the world feel eternal. When they finished, Fuqua screened the final cut privately for Denzel. The actor watched silently, hands clasped. When it ended, he stood up, smiled faintly, and said, "That's enough." That was the wrap. No speeches, no parties, just quiet completion. The marketing phase carried its own poetry. Sony's trailers leaned into mystery. Minimal dialogue, lingering shots of Denzel's face, church bells echoing over landscapes. They marketed it less as action, more as reflection. The tagline, "Justice Knows No Borders," was Fuqua's compromise. His original suggestion had been a man comes to rest, which the studio found too melancholic. Yet, even within corporate framing, the film's meditative heart survived. It became the highest-grossing Equalizer entry, largely through word of mouth. A quirky behind-the-scenes anecdote surfaced after release. During downtime, Denzel taught local kids how to play basketball in the parking lot of a seaside church. The crew brought a hoop, and between takes, they'd play short games. One boy later told reporters, he said, "Every shot is like forgiveness. It only counts if it feels right." That line, unrecorded but remembered, captures Denzel's mindset during the shoot. He wasn't acting anymore. He was living the metaphor. Another beautiful production coincidence occurred during scoring. Composer Harry Gregson Williams wanted to incorporate the sound of Italian bells, but Couldn't find recordings that matched pitch. The production sound team sent him raw audio of bells captured during shooting, the same ones that paused the set. Those became the harmonic bass for the score's final cue. So, in the closing sequence, when McCall smiles as lanterns rise over the sea, the bells you hear are not studio instruments, but the very bells that guided the crew each day. The world that blessed the film became part of it. As filming concluded, Fuqua gathered the cast and crew on the church steps where it had all started. The sun was setting. He told them, "This is not an ending, it's a landing." Denzel hugged him and whispered something only he heard. Later, Fuqua said, "Whatever he said, I felt in my chest like peace." They wrapped at dusk. The locals rang the bells one final time, unplanned, as the trucks drove away. The fun facts and production stories behind the Equalizer 3 reveal why the movie feels so alive yet so calm. It wasn't assembled. It was grown. It's rare to see a Hollywood project made with this kind of quiet devotion, where every constraint becomes grace, every accent becomes metaphor. You can sense that the film's moral, peace through patience, wasn't just performed. It was practiced daily behind the camera. When you watch those glowing streets and hear those real bells, you're not just seeing fiction. You're glimpsing the calm that the crew themselves found. Maybe that's why The Equalizer 3 feels more like farewell than finale. It's not a film about ending violence. It's a film about outgrowing it, both the character and the people who brought him to life. The production itself became what the movie was about, a long exhale after years of noise, a balance restored. There's a quiet alchemy to the setting of The Equalizer 3. It's not just a backdrop. It's the film's soul, the canvas upon which Robert McCall finally dissolves into something gentler than justice. The Amalfi Coast isn't chosen for postcard beauty alone. It's ancient, fragile, eternal, a geography of contradictions, where cliffs guard the sea, where life grows on rock, and where violence can't echo too loudly without being swallowed by wind. It's a world that feels naturally older than guilt. Every stone, every archway, every splash of sunlight on terracotta whispers of civilizations that have risen, burned, and been forgiven. In that world, McCall's presence feels like confession incarnate. From the first frame, the setting begins to teach him something the city never could. The American landscapes of the earlier films, warehouses, neon diners, subway tunnels, were mechanical environments designed for precision and speed. They matched the man he used to be, efficient, compartmentalized, logical. Here, everything breathes. The air itself moves like music. You can't calculate the rhythm of a coastal village. You can only surrender to it. That surrender becomes the visual grammar of the film. The rhythm of editing slows to match the pulse of tides. The color palette, those honeyed oranges, cool sea blues, and graying skies, feels like memory bleaching itself into peace. The town is alive, not a location but character, one that gently teaches McCall how to exist without control. A tranny, where much of the story unfolds, looks like a dream half remembered. Its narrow streets curve like veins, each leading to a square where someone is always smiling, eating, waiting. The cinematography lets us wander with McCall, discovering light as he does. Notice how Robert Richardson frames him through doorways, shutters, and windows, constantly half-contained. It's a visual reminder that he's still not fully inside life. He's observing it through apertures. But as the film progresses, those frames widen. By the festival scene, he's finally standing in open air, surrounded by faces rather than walls. The town doesn't just host him. It heals him through architecture. Every detail of the setting carries emotional intent. The pharmacy, for instance, small, cluttered, warmly lit, becomes a metaphor for McCall's re-entry into community. He enters broken, limping, dependent on the doctor's help. The room is filled with glass bottles and mirrors, reflections everywhere, symbolizing the fractured state of his identity. Later, as he recovers, the same room is filmed in softer focus, the mirrors catching sunlight instead of shadow. Healing becomes visual rather than spoken. The cafe serves a similar purpose. It's always half full, a place of conversation and continuity. Fuqua often frames McCall at the edge of his threshold, as though testing how much belonging he can stand at once. By the final act, when he sits among the townspeople without hesitation, the cafe becomes his cathedral. Even the sea plays a role beyond scenery. Its constancy mirrors the moral rhythm McCall has always sought, balanced through motion. Fuqua uses it almost like a metronome. When McCall feels turmoil, the waves crash louder. When he begins to calm, they stretch into long, steady rolls. At dawn, the sea glows silver, mirroring the clarity he's searching for. At dusk, it burns gold, suggesting transcendence. The water is never still, yet always at peace, exactly what McCall must learn to be. Lighting carries much of the storytelling weight. Richardson's cinematography blends documentary realism with painterly romanticism. Interiors glow like Caravaggio canvases, candlelit warmth against encroaching dark, while exteriors radiate the purity of sunlight that refuses to hide flaws. He avoids artificial contrast. Shadows here aren't black holes but gentle shelters. The film's most striking visual motif is the interplay of warmth and coolness. The violence always happens in cold hues, steel blues, grays, desaturated greens, but the aftermath returns to warmth. Amber kitchens, orange festivals, yellow dawns. The world forgives every bloodstain by outshining it with sunlight. Camera movement tells its own story of transformation. In the beginning, the lens is restless, tracking, pivoting, shadowing McCall's precision. As the narrative unfolds, it becomes meditative. Long, static shots replace motion. Compositions grow symmetrical, deliberate, centered. By the finale, the camera barely moves at all. It has achieved balance. Fuqua describes evolution as a visual heartbeat slowing to normal. When McCall sits by the sea in the end, the camera simply breathes with him. That steadiness is the closure audiences feel but can't explain. The color design of the film deserves its own kind of awe. The palette shifts invisibly through acts. The opening massacre in a winery drenches us in deep maroon and dark wood, the colors of sin and confinement. As McCall heals in a tranny, those hues fade into dusty browns and muted greens. By the midpoint, blue begins to dominate, not cold, but serene, like surrender. And finally, gold overtakes everything: lanterns, sunset, festival flames. The progression feels biblical, from blood to earth to sky to light. It's an evolution from body to soul. You can almost sense Richardson grading with theology rather than technology. Sound design supports this slow sanctification. Every element of the environment breathes in rhythm with McCall's emotions. The echo of footsteps on cobblestone, the creak of wooden doors, the flutter of pigeons in a courtyard, all are woven carefully into the score. There's rarely silence. Instead, there's living quiet, the kind that hums with life rather than emptiness. The use of bells is particularly symbolic. They mark time, yes, but also confession. Every hour, when the bells ring, McCall pauses. It's subtle but deliberate, his old stopwatch habit replaced by divine timing. He's still measuring, but now he's measuring grace instead of control. Even violence obeys a geography. Unlike the anonymous cities of the earlier films, where brutality could hide behind anonymity, Italy makes every act personal. When McCall kills here, the echo stays. The walls remember. Fuqua films it as intrusion, death entering sacred ground. The contrast between sunlight and blood never feels gratuitous. It feels tragic, like watching corruption spoil beauty. That moral dissonance is what gives the action its gravity. You're not meant to cheer, you're meant to grieve a little. And after each act, Fuqua's camera lingers on the setting. The aftermath, the silence, the untouched beauty still standing. The world refuses to be defined by his violence. Architecture becomes theology. The stone steps he climbs daily mirror his slow ascent toward redemption. The narrow passages represent his internal claustrophobia, the smallness of man who has confined himself to purpose. When he finally walks through open piazzas, the frame widens, almost imperceptibly. It's visual language for freedom. Even the church in the film is not one of grandeur but simplicity. Whitewashed walls, uneven benches, flickering candles. It's the kind of place where forgiveness feels accessible, not performative. Fuqua chose it specifically because it looked lived in, not cinematic. He said, "I didn't want holiness. I wanted honesty." The setting's realism enhances, emotional intimacy. You can feel the humidity, the texture of old paint, the way sunlight stings after shadow. The production design by Naomi Shoan uses decay as beauty, peeling walls, chipped tiles, rusting gates. It's a world that imperfect but functional, like McCall himself. Even the marketplace, with its oranges, fish, and chatter, becomes an emblem of life continuing without him. When he finally buys fruit for himself, it's symbolic. He's participating again. The simplest act becomes resurrection. Cinematically, Fuqua and Richardson use repetition to create rhythm. The film begins and ends with similar imagery: a man walking toward light, a watch being stopped, a body lowering into chair or water. These mirror compositions transform the setting into a circular meditation. The town doesn't change, the perception of it does. By the time we reach the festival scene, we realize we've seen that same square earlier, but now it's different, not in design but in feeling. The world hasn't softened, McCall has. There's also a sensory richness to the film that goes beyond visual art. You can almost smell the salt, taste the espresso, feel the fabric of linen shirts drying in sunlight. Fuqua insisted on using directional microphones to capture real ambient sounds rather than stock audio. That decision makes the world feel tactile. You believe in its temperature. This physical realism grounds the film's spiritual elements, keeping them from floating into sentimentality. You're reminded constantly that redemption happens in flesh and dust, not clouds. The interplay of setting and cinematography extends to McCall's body language. In America, he was always upright, centered, symmetrical. In Italy, he begins to slouch, lean, relax. Denzel choreographed these changes intentionally. His posture mirrors the environment's softness. By the film's end, he moves like part of the landscape, slower, deliberate, weathered. The light bends around him as if accepting him. In one unforgettable shot, he stands against the sunset, half in shadow, half in glow, the perfect embodiment of balance. That composition, Richardson said, was pure instinct. The sun decided where he belonged. Fuqua's direction treats setting as moral compass. The more McCall surrenders to beauty, the more peace he earns. When he isolates himself indoors, violence follows. When he steps into sunlight, it disappears. The film visualizes redemption not as internal epiphany, but as environmental surrender. The world forgives him when he finally lets it in. That's why the final scene matters so deeply. He's not saving the town. The town is saving him. The festival, the dancing, the laughter, all of it represents life reabsorbing him. The setting completes his transformation in ways words never could. From a cinematic perspective, The Equalizer 3 uses techniques rarely found in action franchises. The pacing resembles European art cinema more than Hollywood thrillers. Long takes allow the viewer to absorb detail. The drip of wine on a barrel, the crackle of candles, the ripple of light on marble floors. Even the score avoids traditional build-ups. It breathes in sync with the environment. Fuqua allows silence to dominate frames for uncomfortable lengths, trusting the landscape to speak. It's a kind of visual humility, the director stepping aside to let place become protagonist. The visual language also draws heavily from westerns, wide establishing shots, centered figures against horizon lines, moments of pause before moral confrontation. Yet, unlike classic western deserts, this frontier is made of water. The sea becomes McCall's last frontier, endless, cleansing, eternal. Every time he gazes at it, the frame widens slightly, letting infinity bleed in. That widening of perspective mirrors his psychological opening. In older installments, the world around him was small because control demanded limits. Here, it's vast because peace requires surrender. There's an unspoken harmony between all cinematic elements, light, sound, architecture, performance, that gives The Equalizer 3 its near-spiritual texture. Even its violence feels choreographed by geography. The church bells ring seconds before the final massacre begins, as if announcing judgment. The streets funnel movement, like veins directing blood flow. The visual design creates morality out of architecture. Good and evil become spatial decisions. Fuqua's understanding of the setting goes beyond aesthetics. He uses it as cultural contrast, a mirror for McCall's transformation from American individualism to communal existence. In the U.S., McCall fought alone for justice. In Italy, justice becomes shared. The village operates on empathy, on interdependence. Its geography enforces that narrow alleys, shared courtyards, overlapping lives. Isolation is impossible. The very structure of the town denies solitude, and so the setting becomes a therapy his soul didn't know it needed. By the end, the cinematic elements converge in harmony. The palette warms, the rhythm slows, the soundtrack merges with natural ambience, and the camera rests. Richardson's final shot, that slow pan from McCall's peaceful face to the endless blue sea, feels less like cinematography and more like surrender. It's as if the lens itself exhales, finally done with witnessing suffering. That's the beauty of this film's visual storytelling. You can feel the crew's reverence for quiet, their decision to let the world be the main actor. In the end, the setting of the Equalizer 3 doesn't just frame the story. It concludes it. The Amalfi Coast becomes an embodiment of what McCall has been searching for all along, not justice, not balance, but belonging. Its cliffs stand like guardians. Its sea forgive without words. Its light sanctifies every scar. The cinematic world Fuqua and Richardson created isn't merely picturesque. It's merciful. Watching it, you realize the final equalization isn't between right and wrong. It's between man and world, violence and silence, shadow and sunlight. That's the final triumph of the film's setting and cinematography. They don't show redemption. They become it. Behind the camera, The Equalizer 3 felt less like a Hollywood production and more like a pilgrimage. Everyone who came to the Amalfi Coast seemed to arrive with something personal to release: grief, exhaustion, pride, fear of endings. That shared quiet gave the set an atmosphere closer to a monastery than a movie shoot. The schedule was modest, the crew small, and the rhythm unhurried. What emerged was not merely a film, but a kind of communal meditation on craft, friendship, and mortality. You could sense, even in off-camera moments, that they were saying farewell to more than a franchise. Antoine Fuqua has always directed like a musician conducts: rhythm first, emotion second, precision last. But here he changed tempo. He started each morning walking alone before sunrise, headphones around his neck, but never playing anything, just listening to the town waking up. Locals recall seeing him by the pier, hand behind his back, whispering to himself. His assistant once said those walks set the emotional temperature for the day. If he returned smiling, the crew knew the tone would be contemplative. If solemn, expect intensity. It's rare to see an American director relinquish control to place, yet Fuqua did exactly that. He let Italy's stillness dictate camera rhythm, lighting, even dialogue pacing. "The town is my co-director," he told Variety. And he meant it. Denzel Washington matched that surrender in his own way. Gone was the playful storyteller from earlier projects. Here he became almost priestly. He carried a small black notebook filled with handwritten reflections. Not lines, but prayers, quotes, fragments of poetry. During downtime, he'd sit near the fountain, writing quietly while the crew rearranged lights. Sometimes extras approached for photos, and he'd oblige, always calling them amico or amica. A local makeup artist said he thanked everyone at Rap with both hands clasped around theirs, repeating, "Grazie per la pace." Thank you for the peace. He meant it literally. One afternoon early in production, a storm rolled across the Amalfi coastline, delaying exterior shots. Instead of retreating to trailers, Fuqua gathered cast and crew inside the church used for filming. Rain echoed on the roof. He turned off all lights except the candles near the altar and spoke about the trilogy's journey, how the first film represented control, the second consequence, and this one compassion. Denzel sat in the front pew, eyes closed, listening like a student. A camera operator later said that moment changed the entire mood of the shoot. After that, he recalled, no one treated it like work. It felt like closure. Dakota Fanning brought her own quiet nostalgia. She was barely 9 when she last shared the screen with Denzel and Man on Fire, and seeing him again felt to her like meeting a mentor who'd stepped out of memory. The first day they filmed together, Fuqua rolled without rehearsal. The camera lingered on their handshake, the look of recognition between two people who have already lived a lifetime apart. You can see that authenticity in the finished scene. Their eyes carry history no script could reproduce. Offset, she joined Denzel for morning espresso and long conversations about books. He gave her a copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, telling her, "Read this between takes. It'll teach you what McCall learns." The crew itself became a blend of veterans and locals. Fuqua hired Italian assistants, cooks, and transport workers rather than flying in an American army. That choice made the project feel handcrafted. The caterers cooked from home kitchens. Lunch breaks smelled of basil and garlic rather than studio cafeteria steam. Sometimes children of the extras wandered onto set, and instead of being shooed away, they were given clapperboards to hold for rehearsal takes. The production transformed the town into family. When shooting wrapped, locals threw a farewell dinner on the beach, a long wooden table strung with paper lanterns. No speeches, just laughter, wine, and sea wind. Richardson, the cinematographer, toasted in halting Italian. "We came strangers. We leave forgiven." Someone played guitar. Fuqua danced. It was the happiest night of the entire schedule. Robert Richardson's process behind the lens was its own act of devotion. He's known for his bold, sweeping camera movements in Tarantino and Scorsese epics. But here he stripped everything down. He used minimal rigs, often handheld or with small Steadicam setups. He told the gaffer, "I want the light to feel like it came 500 years before electricity." To achieve that, they installed mirrors outside windows to bounce sunlight, instead of using large artificial panels. The result was a living, breathing visual texture, dust motes swirling in shafts of amber light, shadows that move with the hour. Richardson would call out, "Wait 10 minutes. The wall's about to turn gold." No one argued. They waited. That patience became the movie's unseen heartbeat. Behind-the-scenes footage later released in the Blu-ray edition shows Fuqua rarely shouting action. Instead, he'd whisper it, sometimes so softly only the boom operator heard. He said loud commands broke the mood. During emotional scenes, even the technical crew walked barefoot to avoid echoing footsteps on stone floors. When you watch the film, that reverence translates. Every frame carries a hush of a set that treated filmmaking as ceremony. Post-production unfolded back in Los Angeles, but carried the same meditative spirit. Fuqua kept the editing room dimly lit, burning incense, playing Italian folk music quietly in the background. He and editor Conrad Buff reviewed dailies in silence before speaking. If a scene felt too perfect, they often roughened it, trimming polish, adding longer pauses. "Imperfection lets the spirit through," Fuqua said. They finished the final cut at midnight in early summer 2023. Instead of champagne, they poured espresso, clinked cups, and watched the credits roll twice without talking. The film's fight choreography had its own understated poetry. Unlike the rapid mechanical precision of the earlier installments, stunt coordinator Olivier Kirkland focused on realism over spectacle. He studied medical textbooks to choreograph attacks based on anatomy rather than flourish. Denzel practiced with a retired paramedic to understand how pressure points could incapacitate without glamour. Between takes, he'd remind extras, "We're not dancing, we're telling consequence." That ethos turned each violent act into moral punctuation, clean, deliberate, remorseful. Crew members joked that his fights looked like prayers interrupted. One day, while shooting a nighttime ambush scene in Naples, the power grid of the entire street failed. Production halted in darkness. Instead of waiting for technicians, Richardson lit candles inside windows, creating a spontaneous chiaroscuro glow. Fuqua loved it so much he changed the blocking to incorporate that new light. In the finished movie, the flickering shadows behind McCall as he walks down the corridor are not planned. They're the byproduct of that power outage. The accident gave the moment its haunted calm, turning technical failure into aesthetic miracle. Sound designer Benjamin A. Burr approached the film as if it were a meditation album disguised as thriller. He recorded real Amalfi waves, market chatter, and footsteps on cobblestone, layering them into what he called breathing atmospheres. When McCall exhales during quiet scenes, the air around him subtly harmonizes with ocean resonance. Burt used frequency mapping to tune ambient sound to the same key as the musical score, an invisible cohesion audiences feel rather than notice. Every whisper of wind vibrates at the same tone as the strings in the soundtrack, so piece literally sounds musical. Perhaps the most moving behind-the-scenes moment came near the end of production. Denzel had just finished his last scene, the festival shot where McCall smiles among villagers. Fuqua called cut, but no one moved. The extras kept clapping, the crew kept rolling, and Denzel stayed seated, looking out toward the sea. After nearly a minute, he stood, bowed slightly to the crowd, and whispered, "Grazie." Richardson kept the camera running. That unplanned gesture became the emotional template for the final shot used in the film. What we see on screen isn't acting. It's gratitude captured raw. During those final weeks, the cast developed rituals for calm. Fanning meditated in the mornings. Fuqua sketched storyboards in charcoal. Richardson played jazz quietly from his phone between takes. Denzel preferred silence, but sometimes hummed gospel under his breath. Locals would stop and listen, unsure whether they were hearing music or prayer. The line blurred, as it often did on that set. Every film has its myths, and the Equalizer 3 collected its share. Crew whispers tell of an old fisherman who visited daily to watch filming from the rocks. On rap day, he approached Denzel and said in Italian, "You remind me of the sea, calm on top, storms underneath." Denzel smiled and replied, "Then maybe I'm home." The fisherman nodded and walked away. They never learned his name. That line, "Maybe I'm home," became Fuqua's favorite phrase. He later used it in interviews to summarize the trilogy's conclusion. Technical challenges abounded but were embraced as texture. Filming on the Amalfi Coast meant constant negotiation with weather, tourists, and narrow alleys. Trucks couldn't reach many locations, so gear was carried by hand. Sometimes they used donkeys for transport, no exaggeration. The animal handlers joked that even the equipment took part in the pilgrimage. The camera crew developed muscle memory for moving quietly through stone corridors, treating gear like sacred objects. When the film later premiered, Fuqua dedicated it to the men and women who carried light up those hills. The score recording sessions at Abbey Road became another small miracle. Composer Marcelo Zarvos conducted a 64-piece orchestra, but insisted they play without metronome, allowing tempo to drift naturally, like breathing. He told them, "This music must feel like water finding its level." After the final take, the musicians applauded each other, rare for studio professionals, sensing they played something larger than commission. The raw audio included the creak of chairs and rustle of sheet music, and instead of editing it out, Fuqua kept those sounds faintly in the mix. Life inside art, imperfect, human, real. Publicity teams later admitted that marketing such a quiet film as a summer thriller was difficult. Denzel refused late-night talk show appearances. He wanted the work to speak for itself. When journalists visited the set, he greeted them warmly but declined interviews. "Some words shouldn't compete with the silence we're building," he said. That restraint created mystery, amplifying curiosity. When trailers finally dropped, audiences sensed something different. The absence of noise became its own advertisement. The behind-the-scenes camaraderie extended to post-release life. Fuqua sent handwritten letters to crew members thanking them for trusting stillness. Richardson gifted each department a framed photograph of Denzel standing against sunset, signed simply Balance. The editor kept the original clapperboard hanging in his home office, still dusty from Amalfi sand. These tokens became relics of a rare production that treated filmmaking as memory-making, not brand-building. In retrospect, those who worked on the Equalizer 3 speak of it less as job, more as experience. The prop master compared it to a long prayer disguised as cinema. The location manager said he'd never seen a lead actor so humble with locals. One day, an elderly woman brought Denzel homemade pastries and asked him to bless her grandson. He placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, said something soft, and continued eating without fanfare. Moments like that blurred fiction and reality, McCall's compassion bleeding into Denzel's humanity. Perhaps the strangest and most beautiful coincidence occurred weeks after wrap. A local newspaper reported that the same church used in the film had restored its long broken bell, funded by donations from anonymous sources, likely members of the crew. When the bell rang again that first Sunday, villagers gathered outside, calling it the Equalizer's bell. That sound now exists beyond the movie, a permanent echo of what the production left behind. So many contemporary sets feel industrial, filled with deadlines, metrics, and marketing noise. This one felt elemental. There were no egos, no spectacle, only the hum of work done in faith. You can feel that energy when you watch the finished film. The patience of craftsmen who trusted time, the reverence of performers who understood silence, the grace of director who finally learned that less truly can be more. The Amalfi Light, the sea, the villagers, the bells, all became collaborators rather than context. And maybe that's the deepest behind-the-scenes truth of the Equalizer 3. Everyone involved surrendered their individual will to a collective serenity. They stopped trying to control the story and let it unfold like weather. In doing so, they create a film that feels breathed into existence rather than built. When the final shot fades to the horizon, you're not just seeing the end of McCall's journey. You're feeling the serenity of a cast and crew who found their own balance along the way. There are films that speak in dialogue and films that speak in silence. The Equalizer 3 belongs to the latter. Its language isn't in words or action, but in the spaces between them. In the slow turn ahead, the reflection of light on stone, the quiet acknowledgement of pain. Every element of its construction, from Denzel Washington's measured presence to Antoine Fuqua's patient direction, carries meaning layered beneath surface realism. Watching it is like reading a parable about balance disguised as a thriller about vengeance. Its symbols operate gently, almost invisibly, but one scene they haunt you. The sea, the watch, the bells, the cane, the wine, the wound, and above all, the stillness. At its heart, the film is about equilibrium, not the mechanical kind of call once measured with a stopwatch, but moral equilibrium, the kind that emerges when chaos finally exhausts itself into peace. For 2 previous installments, McCall lived by precision. Time, motion, symmetry. Justice was an equation. Sin had an answer. Here those equations break down. Violence no longer satisfies. The man who once measured balance through control now learns it through surrender. Every object he touches carries his transformation. The watch, his oldest companion, once marked death, now becomes a relic of time released. When he stops it near the end, the gesture feels both symbolic and spiritual. The cessation of judgment, the acceptance of imperfection. Time ceases to be something he conquers. It becomes something he enters. The wound he sustains early on functions almost sacramentally. It forces stillness upon man addicted to motion. The wound is not punishment but invitation, to rest, to heal, to be human. It's fascinating how Fuqua frames pain not as spectacle, but as teacher. The camera lingers not on blood, but on recovery, not on the violence inflicted, but on the hand that sutures it. Dr. Enzo, with his quiet compassion, becomes more than healer. He's the film's priest figure, administering grace through medicine. In one sense, he stands for community itself, the reminder that redemption is a collective act. McCall, who's always saved others alone, must now be saved by someone else. That reversal lies at the heart of the film's moral code. Salvation cannot be self-administered. Religious symbolism hums through the film like a second soundtrack, but never loudly. The church bells, the wine, the confessions, the sea's baptismal undertones, they all point toward resurrection rather than repentance. When McCall drinks coffee at the cafe surrounded by townspeople, it feels like Eucharist. Ordinary life turns sacred by humility. His violent hands, once instruments of retribution, now hold cups, bread, and tools. Fuqua frames those gestures with reverence. Every act of gentleness becomes liturgical, every small kindness a prayer. The film's theology, if it is one, is profoundly humanist. Divinity isn't in heaven. It's in how people treat one another when no one is watching. The sea, perhaps the film's most persistent symbol, represents both infinity and forgiveness. It's always there, restless but calm, vast but intimate. McCall spends long moments just looking at it, as though searching for reflection that won't come. The sea is his mirror, fluid, shifting, unable to hold image. It refuses to define him. In that refusal, it frees him. Throughout the film, water recurs in subtle ways. The washing of his wounds, the rain that cleans blood from streets, the ocean that ends each day. It's no coincidence that the final shot belongs to water, unending, luminous, free. Fuqua turns the sea into metaphor for absolution. It accepts everything without judgment. The bells that punctuate the narrative serve as moral metronome. They replace McCall's stopwatch as his measured time. In earlier films, he was a god of seconds. Now time belongs to the divine. The bells remind him that there's a rhythm larger than his control, the pulse of a world that continues with or without him. Each ring marks his gradual alignment with that rhythm. By the festival scene, when the bells and laughter merge, sound becomes symbol. Man and world finally in harmony. Light itself carries thematic weight. Richardson's cinematography transforms illumination into language. Shadows are not just aesthetic, they're moral terrain. At the film's beginning, McCall exists mostly in chiaroscuro, light slicing across half his face, leaving the other half in darkness. As he heals and integrates his past, those shadows soften. By the end, his face glows evenly, bathed in sunset gold. It's a visual manifestation of integration. Good and evil, violence and compassion, both coexisting without denial. The journey isn't from dark to light, but from division to unity. Another crucial symbol is community. In the first two films, McCall's relationships were transactional. He helped people, then disappeared. Here, connection becomes transformative. The townspeople's simple acts, a shared meal, a joke, a repaired lock, teach him that belonging isn't weakness. Fuqua uses the geography of a tranny to externalize this idea. The town's narrow alleys force proximity. You cannot pass through without brushing against others. Symbolically, that closeness becomes therapy. The Equalizer, once defined by isolation, learns to live within touch. The cane he carries after his injury doubles as weapon and crutch, a perfect metaphor for duality. It supports him but can also harm others, reminding us that the tools of violence can be repurposed for balance.